wander in.
Do you have your mic on?
I don't. I have it on, it's just not on. Yeah. Hey, actually it was on. Can you hear it?
I can hear that.
Huh. A little tiny bit. I will talk a little tiny bit louder. Okay. So we're in lesson 3 of our book, In His Image. Is there anybody that needs a copy of the lesson book tonight? We can share you a copy for the night. Everybody good? All right, let's start with a prayer then, shall we? Heavenly Father, we pray that you would give us wisdom as we go through this life. Help us to learn to follow you. Help us to learn to love you. And we pray that you would give us the joy that comes from knowing you. We pray that you would be with us tonight as we study. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're in the indifference, and I had asked as we had finished up the last class for some people to think about some examples of indifference that you've seen in your life. Have you been indifferent to anything, or have you seen somebody being indifferent to something? Has anybody had a chance to think about that, either then or now or yesterday? Indifference. Has anybody ever been indifferent to getting their homework done when they were in school? Well, I should get it done. Maddie's saying yes, but she graduated. All right, she's done.
When I had we had a radio program in Southern California for a couple of years. I did one for 6 months in Eugene when I was there. It's a call-in Bible question program. And the city of Eugene and community that I was reaching out to was just totally indifferent.
To your program, they were indifferent to that.
I could try to say things almost outlandishly to try to arouse.
Provocative.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Some response, some call, some, hey, how dare you? Nothing.
Right.
Nothing. And after 6 months, I told the elders it's not working. It's not working. It doesn't work in this community.
So there's an example of a community being indifferent to that response. Could you be indifferent to wearing your seatbelt? Take it or leave it. Yeah? What else? Give me some other examples.
Well, I'm reminded of a famous court case, or police case in New York many years ago of a young woman being raped and murdered in an alley in New York City, and there were many passages.
38 witnesses or something like that. I read about that this person being brutally assaulted and murdered, and all of these people either in the buildings or passing by or seeing this, hearing it, and nobody responded to help this lady. They were indifferent to that. Okay.
Not even going so far as to call the police, and not checking it out themselves, but calling the police.
So there's an example of not taking action. Somebody else have another? Indifference. When we have indifference in our lives, Dan uses this term, the opposite of love. What's the opposite of love? Hate, what we often say, right? That's what we kind of grew up thinking, it's hate and love. But Dan's point has been several times, and one I'd seen a number of people pointing out, the opposite of love is indifference, apathy, not caring at all about the person. So indifference is, even though when I saw this as one of our first ones, I went, why are we putting that first? I'm going, well, if we don't care, are we going to make any difference in our lives or in other people's lives if we just don't care? Indifference is one that we will all have to work on in our own lives. I see indifference in some ways as indifference towards something means we are not prioritizing that thing to be very high in our lives. We could be indifferent to seatbelt wearing, as I mentioned. Cindy, you had something?
Well, I was just going to say there was an instance where Roger was doing a wedding ceremony, and the
There you go. That sounds like Roger.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so the person was indifferent. In fact, maybe in this case they were actually the other way. I'd rather not hear about him, as it sounded like to me. You don't have to put that in. Don't put that in. Roger did anyway. Okay. Tammy?
Well, I think there's many things we don't prioritize. I'm not a gardener. I'm kind of indifferent to it. I do pay somebody so it looks kept up, but I don't care that much about it.
What do you enjoy instead?
I enjoy reading a book.
So you prioritize those things
Right.
to the exclusion of gardening. So when we don't do I use seatbelt back to the third time just because I got back in my head thinking about, what's the result of being indifferent towards seatbelts? You could get a ticket. You could be danger. You could be harmful. Or it could be nothing, right? How many of us grew up never putting a seatbelt on when we ever got in a car and never really had a problem with that, right? So indifference could lead to no harm in some cases, or it could lead to a, wow, I wish I would have done that differently when I get in the accident. Another thought there on that, Cindy?
Well, my brother, and nobody should do this, but he would not wear his seatbelt because the government told him he had to wear a seatbelt.
Right.
So what he did was, our retired doctor, he got a note from him written that he doesn't need to wear one because of a shoulder injury.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That would be the opposite of indifference, though, because he really didn't want to wear it. It wasn't take it or leave it. It was, I don't want to wear that seatbelt. But in the indifference side, Otto, you had another?
You can go ahead and finish.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you were talking about how many of us grew up without ever wearing a seatbelt. Some of us grew up when seatbelts didn't exist.
Yeah.
And so when seatbelts came along, we said, hey, we've been driving for 20 years. Now you want us to wear this?
Right.
What good's it going to do? So there was indifference to it because we hadn't learned. We didn't know how good what a safety device that was.
Yep.
So it was indifference, but it was a different kind of.
Yeah. In our car, the seatbelt was my mom's arm doing this. That was, we had to stop really fast. I found out where the seatbelts were when I had to clean under the seat, and you'd see these things under. But indifference may not cause you any problem, is the point I was trying to make with seatbelts. It may not if you never get in an accident. If you never get into a situation where that's needed, didn't really make much difference. But if it does, and now apply that, it could save your life, right? Now apply that to Christian principles. Encourage increasing your spiritual strength, your faith. If you're indifferent to that and you never really get challenged, you might be able to go through life without really much trouble. But when you do get challenged, when those things show up that you're going to go, oh, maybe it would be now my faith would be better. It would be nicer now if my faith were stronger. I wish I didn't have to go through this now, not knowing the things I could have known of how to deal with this or how to reach out or do those things that would allow me to have a better life. Go ahead, Randy.
I know this is not an example of indifference, but it's kind of the opposite as what you were just talking about, is of Daniel in Daniel, the first chapter. So he, instead of being indifferent about, oh, well, I'm carted off into Babylon, whatever happens, he purposed in his heart not to defile himself.
So the better choice would be to purpose in your heart. And I guess that's why putting this down as the first of because the other two were kind of introduction lessons, it seemed like to me. We're looking at attitudes right now over the next few lessons of attitudes that we should or shouldn't have in our lives. And this is why, as I started looking at this going, boy, I better not be indifferent to my spiritual life, because it will harm me in the long term if I regard them as unimportant, or if I have a lack of interest or a lack of emotion toward that. Because if we apply this externally, if we're indifferent toward our neighbor, then as we were mentioning on the first part, that means we don't love our neighbor. Because if we love our neighbor, we're not indifferent toward them. So there's a whole bunch of things that we need to self-assess on this. Nobody's going to come up to Michaela and say, Michaela, I think your indifference factor is a little too high right now. And then nobody's going to do that to her. we have to do it for ourselves, right? Sometimes spouses will do that gently, reminding us of something we need to pay attention more to. But most of the time, we have to step back and say, how is my heart today on this issue? So this author kind of then, in 21, page 21 as we're going through, he's trying to equate it to the right amount of self-importance. If we don't love ourselves, then we're going to self-pity instead. But if we think too highly of ourselves, then we're not going to have time for those. Our priorities are going to be different. So he kind of points to that. Love your neighbor as yourself, Mark 12:31. And I'm not sure I agreed with that one too much, because I think I could have too high or too low of a self-importance and still be indifferent or not be indifferent. So I wasn't sure that connection made sense to me on why this having the right level of self-importance had anything to do with indifference. I think it has to do with being active as a Christian and doing things the way we should toward others. I do agree with that, but I'm not sure about the indifference. Anybody have a thought on that? Why did he put indifference in here when he was talking about this balance of self, not seeing yourself as too important?
Sorry,
Sam?
I'm on board with you.
Okay.
That's a poor connection.
Okay. In my case, I just couldn't quite catch it, but I was hoping somebody else here would be able to.
Well, I think, rather than just say, because of this unhealthy self-image problem there in the next to last paragraph, we become indifferent, I think he should have said, we can become
I think that's the key, yeah.
Because it's a lot more easy to be indifferent if I'm all focused on myself and not thinking about others. Or if I'm all focused on myself and thinking, I can't help others, and so why even worry about them?
Right.
And so that can also cause indifference. It's not a one-for-one, but it does create an environment where that can happen.
And I would go with that. I would say it creates an environment. We should have the best view of ourselves, the God, what view that God wants of ourselves as we're going through this. He doesn't want it. He knows our limitations and our strengths, right? So he's not going to ask more of us than we can do. And he's going to, we're going to go through and talk about the one-talent man here in a bit. He expects some return on his investment in us. It's not just a zero-sum, hey, you're there, good luck. So we need the right attitude about our own internal view of where we're going. So the Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1, we're on page 22 here, halfway down. Therefore we must give a more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. That to me is the more important reason not to be indifferent. Because if we're indifferent, then even if we start out in the right spot, you're on a boat, you're going down a river, and you don't really worry about the steering because the river's going downstream, you just ride it along. Won't be too long until you're drifting into the trees on the side of the bank. You can't be indifferent about your Christian path, your journey as in life, or you will end up in the shallow water, to use that example of boating, because you have to be making self-corrections, or you will not go where you want to go. So, this author says that except for lack of Bible knowledge, the most serious problem in the Lord's church today is indifference. And I read that and I went, well, I don't know, maybe. I think for some it is. Yeah?
I think it's just the opposite.
It's too much caring?
No, I think indifference causes a lack of Bible knowledge. If I'm indifferent, I'm not going to have the Bible
Yeah.
knowledge. So
I don't think he was...
Indifference is the number one problem, and it creates people who don't want to know, they don't care to know, they don't study, they don't want to study.
Got it. I think he was... I don't think he was prioritizing those two. I think he did say that was the number one, but it's a very high level is kind of what I think he was saying. But indifference can lead to that lack of knowledge. I agree. I think that's probably the biggest reason. Because if we weren't indifferent toward learning about God and what he wants us to do and how he wants us to live in our lives, we'd be doing that, and we wouldn't be in a lack of knowledge situation.
I remember when I first moved here, 3 hours every day.
This is Howard Reagan, one of the former elders here. Go ahead.
And he told me, he said, Dan, he said, listen, worldliness is the worst problem with the church. You need to preach on worldliness at least once a month. And I don't know that it's worldliness. Again, I think indifference allows worldliness to come in. I'm just convinced, in my own self over the years of my life, that in the church and spiritually, that indifference is the number one problem.
And Cindy?
With Revelations 3, 15 and 16 about being lukewarm, would that would fall into that category, correct?
Yeah, say about what again? I've got it listed here.
I know your works that you are
Oh,
neither
lukewarm.
cold nor hot,
Yes.
or that you were cold or hot. So then because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spew you out of my mouth.
Yes.
So I'm saying, yes.
I agree. Yes, I think so. We're going to get to that a little bit further because I spent a lot of time looking at cold or hot. What does that mean? Because yes, I do think that's a direct thing that Jesus is telling them. They should have been some other thing than what they were, because lukewarm was not it. And I do think indifference is in that. We aren't going to be bothering to get cold or hot. We'll just be whatever the room temperature is right now. That's not what Jesus wanted of that group. So this, go ahead, Sam.
Cold can be refreshing. Hot can be comforting. Lukewarm is just
Yep.
meh.
Yep.
Ultimate
MEH,
statement
meh.
of indifference.
Yeah. Whatever. Yeah, that's another one.
Whatever be up there, but it's easier to say.
So signs to watch for to know if you are lukewarm. So Cindy just brought up the lukewarm reference there, and this author is pointing out we can look and self-assess. Do we feel it's a drudgery to attend a Bible class or a meeting of other Christians? If the preacher goes a few minutes too long, are we giving him the look? Or is it the joy that we have of coming together? Have we lost that? If it's like, I maybe never had it because I was, I'm supposed to. It's my duty. If that's the way we see the world, then we're going to lean toward that. Do I want to go do that again? So we need to be assessing that. How is my heart when it comes to getting together with other Christians? Because that we see encouraging one another all the more as you see the day approaching. God is telling us, getting together, don't forsake the assembling of yourself together. Why? Because when we get together, it's to be encouraging us so we can be stronger together. So that's why if you're not coming, you're missing out. Now, everybody I'm saying that to is here. So how do we convince our neighbor, our fellow Christian, or the neighbor that's across the street that they need this? If we're not making it a priority in our own life, then certainly they're not going to see that. So I'm happy that you're all here today. And we're going to be trying to continue to encourage people when we see them. Debbie and I were just having a conversation about, is Sunday morning, because this kind of stuff comes up, is Sunday morning all that God requires? That's all. He didn't say we had to get together more than that. There's no Wednesday night service in the Bible that we found. Those kinds of comments I've heard a number of times over the years. And that's true. I mean, they met together from house to house daily, some of them, and some of them searched the scriptures daily. But as far as when they met, it didn't seem like they went on a Wednesday night. That seems like not what they did. But does that mean us getting together on a Wednesday night for a Bible class or a Sunday afternoon, is that helpful or is it harmful for us? And we're discussing that, and we're saying, on some people, they just don't feel that there's enough benefit to them to overcome the inertia of where they're at. It's tough. It's not zero effort to get out here on a rainy Sunday afternoon or a dark and cold Wednesday night. Or when your neighbor, your Christian fellow Christian is not been visited by any members of the church for a week, it's not easy to go, how am I going to get that done? It takes effort. And our indifference leads us to, well, maybe I'll just stay here where I am. So and I keep reading this, and every time I went back through this, I went, wow, there's more for me, this double check of when we've seen people drift away, this verse that we just read in Hebrews 2, if you've been in the church for any length of time, you've seen people drift away, right there, Norm. And when you watch that happening and you don't go and reach out, why? Why am I not reaching out? When I see somebody who's obviously having some struggles with wanting to be about Christian things, and that overcoming part is what I'm hoping will take Norm, and then John, and then Henry. Go ahead, Norm.
Indifference means that I don't care, right?
That's what we generally consider it, yes.
So if I have an opinion on something one way or another, I'm no longer indifferent.
Yeah. Well, yes, you're no longer indifferent to that thing, correct. I would agree.
Right.
So, good. John?
To kind of answer the very last question that you brought up about why don't we reach out to folks, I think a lot of times it comes down to I don't want to take the time to take the time.
It takes work.
Because it's going to involve my getting involved, and I really don't want to take the time.
Time and risk, because what if we reach out and we're rebuffed or we're rejected, and so there's a risk that that'll happen. Henry, and then back to Norm.
Well, I would just say that, following the examples of the early Christians, they didn't let things get in their way of coming together and being indifferent about attending, being a part of. They were jealous, zealous for the things that they believed in, and so God knows our heart.
Right.
So if you're sitting back and being indifferent about, say, attending to be with other Christians, you need to be worried about that.
Yeah, and I didn't want this whole class to be about that. And by the way, when he gave the thing about don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, wasn't it to the first century Christians that he told that to? So there were first century Christians who were being indifferent. They weren't coming together. And he told them, stop that. Get back. Don't forsake that. That's something that's important for you. So there were some, but as you say, there were others who met regularly and continuously and saw that as a source of strength for them. And I hope we can all get there eventually, because I think we will all be stronger and better for that. Norm, you had another comment?
John brought up time. Don't have the time. I don't want to take the time.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I do that, I'm no longer indifferent because I'm motivated by my own desire to do something else.
So there's, I wrote down, I saw an article on this, and I thought right there would be a good time to bring those up. This author pointed out one of the reasons we're indifferent, that one of the reasons we don't step in for whatever those things is, I don't have the skills. I don't have the ability to do whatever that is, so I'll stay here where I'm at. I don't have the time. I'm so busy with other things. If I had the time, I would do that, but I just don't have that time. Or I'm feeling capable of it. I just capable of helping. This person I can't help. This person I'm not connected with them. I just wouldn't be able to help them. Or if I ignore these problems now, my life will be happier. I thought that was an interesting thing. We think we're going to be happier and more content in our life by ignoring some of these other things and being indifferent toward them. And it comes down to whether or not you love your neighbor. And that's this author's point. I thought there was some truthfulness to that. And again, that self-looking in our own lives is going to be what it takes to determine if that's the case for me. Some people feel guilty if they're not doing those things, and there's another side to that, right? Guilt is not indifference. Guilt is, oh, I should be doing that, but I'm not doing that. Well, does God want us to walk around feeling guilty all the time? I don't think that's what he wants either. So there's this middle ground that says, I want to be able to help. We're going to look at a couple of those examples here shortly. And being able to act when I can, when I have the ability, when the need is there, I'm going to go ahead and do that. But I'm not going to say I didn't solve all of the problems of my brothers and sisters and neighbors, so I'm guilty because I didn't do any of that. That's not what God's looking for either, I think. Go ahead, Tim.
Isn't
8 girl, all she did is, she saw they had the problem and she mentioned, here's something you can try. And because she wasn't indifferent that, I don't really care, I'm just doing my job. She did care and she couldn't solve the problem, but she could mention something.
Good point. Do what you can. So there were some biblical examples of indifference, and that was the opposite of one, as Tim was pointing out, that we heard about this morning. Obadiah, the 1 chapter, verses 10 and 11. Who can get to the book of Obadiah? It's in the Old Testament, and verses 10 and 11. Who's got that one for us? I'm going to call on somebody if I don't see anybody raising hands, so everybody be looking it up.
I have it.
Oh, Dan, would you read Obadiah 10 and 11?
Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, and this is aimed at Edom, because of your violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, you will be destroyed forever. On the day you stood aloof, while the strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them.
So while the strangers came in to pillage Jerusalem, Edomites, who were related by earlier relatives, they were related by blood, they just watched them come in and went, wow, look at that, they're pillaging Jerusalem. And God is going back to them and saying, you shouldn't have done that. That's not the way you should have been acting. So there's an example where doing nothing was not inoffensive to God.
Well, we also see a little bit, just, a verse further in there, that there was some feelings for the Israelites. It says, you should not gloat over your brother. So while they should have had compassion for all this that was going on, they were plugged out of it, and there was a little bit of gloating too from other past problems
Right.
that Israelites and Edomites had. So there's also not necessarily only indifference that we need to overcome. It's
You got what you deserved?
the lack of compassion, the lack of other things.
I guess I have a harder time sometimes on the challenges with people asking me for $10, for something on the way by. It's harder for me to not give, not because I don't think I'm helping that person personally. I don't think I'm giving them a better life by giving them money out of my window when they're standing by there with the sign, anything helps, God bless. But I fight against the thing about, if you made different choices in your life, you wouldn't be standing here. You wouldn't be, causing me to feel guilty of not giving you anything. But that's not helping them either. And so where's that middle ground that when we can help that person, we can bring a chicken sandwich and say, here's not $5 so you can go buy some drugs or alcohol. Here's a chicken sandwich because if you're hungry, you'll appreciate that. Who was it that had a package? Was it Megan had a package of stuff in her car that had some socks and some stuff that she had right there. And so when she would see somebody like that, she'd just keep driving and throw it at them, try to hit it with her. No, she didn't do that. That's not what she did. She had something to give, and I thought that was a very good planning ahead thing. Instead of feeling guilty, or instead of being indifferent and saying, well, I don't care about that guy, look for the opportunity for participation. So Edomites didn't do that. They didn't come in and say, wait a minute, that's not right. They just stepped back. So those 38 people who heard this lady screaming in New York, they stepped back instead of at least calling the police. They could have done that. Yes?
Along that same vein, in our world today where you have access to all this media and stuff, I think you have to have some level of, if you're going to call it indifference, to what happens to other people. Because if you cared as much as you do about your family, about every single person, you'd explode of emotion or whatever. If you think about it literally like that. So I think we have access to so much information and stories about everything all over the world. You can't be super passionate about all of love and work hard and stuff to, you know, your family, your community, and as Christians, especially our church family and stuff like that. And you have to do some, if you have access, if you're seeing all this stuff, you can't, you're gonna kill yourself or give yourself a heart attack if you're being really involved and really passionate with everything that we see, because we can see so much from the media, but people can shrink that bubble
Right.
too far and only care about themselves or their immediate family. And we've got to find the right level of having the effort and the compassion and the drive and everything like that, just that amount of love, the not indifference for the right size community.
I think God used that community to be your neighbor.
Right.
Love your neighbor as yourself. It's hard to be a neighbor with somebody you never met in another country that they may be having terrible things happen to them. How am I going to help them? And how can I have compassion on them? But I can on the person that I see here.
And that woman there, she was right in front of them.
Yes.
That's the neighbor right there.
Right.
I mean, that's very similar to the Good Samaritan.
And nobody became a Samaritan at that time. Yeah. Yeah. Very sad. So this author then picks a couple of churches in the Revelation letter to point out the examples of what indifference can bring. Ephesus. I always think of Ephesus as a vibrant and, you know, Paul spent years there, and he brought the Ephesian elders down, and when he was going back by, because he wanted to make sure they were, you know, taking care, they were right with him on things, and they seemed like such a strong group. And then a few years later, when John's relating Jesus' words, and he's going right to them, they wouldn't bear evil, they hated immorality, they were workers, but what had they done? They had left their first love. So I kind of thought about that earlier as they loved something else. I mean, that may have been more of what this author's pointing out is maybe they left it because they were just indifferent toward it. They didn't love something else. They weren't going after another God. They just weren't going toward God.
I often saw them as being such fighters that was where all their focus was. You can almost see their Bible classes being talking against false teachers and this, and never touching on the greater things, you know, compassion, sacrifice,
The weightier matters.
The weightier matters, and that in the urgent with all this fight, you know, Satan fighting against them, that they did all those urgent things without ever touching on the important things.
Their first love.
Their first love.
God has so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And so that's the first love that we should have. And we need to not get sidetracked, even if it's for good things. Being diligent in other areas, he tells us that they were diligent. Somebody know your deeds and your toil and your perseverance. He wasn't saying the Ephesians were terrible people, but you can be doing good things and lose the focus of why you're doing those good things. And so that's what we're doing today, is reminding each of us, why are you doing the things that you do? Ask yourself, before you leave this class, ask yourself, why am I doing the things that I do? Why do I go to church? Why do I call myself a Christian? Why do I, or do I not, read my Bible or share the gospel with others? Or why do I do those things or not do those things? And hopefully what we'll see is, like this example of Ephesians, because God wants us to be acting in a certain way. So if we want to be pleasing to him, then we need to adjust those attitudes, whatever they are. Maybe they're right in these areas, but not in this one, like the Ephesians. So now it's time to adjust. That's a harder thing, I think, for us to do. Sometimes we can recognize we should be better in this area, but how do I get there? And I'm saying, get together more with other Christians, do some more studying, care about those kinds of things. Debbie and I were talking about relationship issues. And if you ever read a book on relationship issues, I shouldn't say it those ways, should I? So If you ever looked into those kinds of things, you could probably get better at some of those kinds of things. But if you never look at a book about those or get somebody else's opinion, or sit in quiet meditation, or put any energy at all into those things, you will never get better at those things. So you got to self-identify, and then you've got to take action. Indifference is the opposite of those things. You just don't care, and even if you do see it, you don't do anything about it. We need to be the opposite of that. And we can each do that today. In each one of our lives, that can change today. Go ahead.
I can also see the possibility of indifference being, we kind of forcefully become indifferent as a defense mechanism, because like I've been thinking about Paul. I think we can all pretty easily say he was the opposite of indifferent. He is not an indifferent person. He cares so much. And like you were saying, the opposite of indifference kind of seems like love, especially when you look at Paul. He loved so many people all over, in all these different places that he traveled. And in his letters, he's talking about how I'm praying for you all the time. And I mean, to the Corinthians and stuff that we've been studying, like, it agonizes him when he hears about Christians who got messed up on something or whatever. He cares a whole lot. And so he had a lot of agony in his life just because of how much he cared. He also had a lot of joy and love in his life.
Right.
But those both come with the caring, with the opposite of indifference.
Yep.
So I think if you really do truly care about something, but it's just so hard and it comes with the bad parts sometimes, you can sort of
I better put it aside.
forcefully,
Yeah.
like you trick yourself into being indifferent because it's just easier that way.
Yeah. You don't have the pain that goes with it. Yeah, Paul wasn't indifferent before he became a Christian. He was definitely against Christianity. He wasn't indifferent toward it. So, another thought? Nope. Otto had something.
Before we do that section, there's one other thing in that section here in the book that says, losing the first love refers to the fading enthusiasm of a child of God.
Mm-hmm.
And how many of us here, or in any congregation, can see that happening to somebody, and the first thing they do is, well, I'm not going to bother them. Or other people will come to somebody that's very close to that person and say, how's so-and-so doing? And when that happens to me, my answer is, why don't you call them? Why don't you write them a card? Why don't you tell them you miss them? That's not happening.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's not happening here in this congregation. There's plenty of that happening, and it's not happening. It's being brought to the attention of people, and it's just not happening.
Not happen as much as we like. I've seen it happen personally, watched it happen where people have reached out. But there's a whole bunch of people who could use what you're talking about. When you see it, again, I may not see the need of that person laying alongside of the road just being taken over, being thumped, but you might. And so when you see that, don't step back, as Maddie's saying, the defense mechanism. Instead of that, do what Otto's talking about. Call them and talk to them. Reach out. You'll find out that the more you do that, I think, the more you do that, the easier that will be, and you'll be thankful that you did it, and so will they.
I just want to add one thing too, to Dan's credit. He and I were together one day, and a person that hadn't attended for a long time said to Dan, long time no see. And Dan's response was, that's not my fault. So whose fault was it? And it put it right on that individual.
Yeah.
And that individual realized what had been said. But those are the kind of things that we miss. We miss taking advantage of an opportunity like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So the encouraging one another is really what I see God wanting us to do. We have to do some rebuking and reproof concept at times, but we just read the proverb that if you rebuke a fool, they won't be any wiser, but if you rebuke a wise man, then they'll love you more. That concept of, so it's hard to know when's the time to use the tough love and when's the time to extend the hand of love.
Well, you have to read the person. You
Yeah.
have to know the person to know that. Bill Cannon, who used to attend here for a long time, and he just quit. Hardly see him anymore. And I didn't hardly recognize him when I saw him in the Prince Food store that day. But as I was walking by, I told Bob, I said, that's Bill Cannon. And so I turned around and back to him. I said, Bill. I said, oh, hi, Dan. I said, I haven't seen you for a long time. It's time to come home. I mean, so there's encouragement rather than, it's not my fault that I haven't seen you. You haven't been around. But you have to determine, okay, I've often told people you use a different kind of stick on a horse and a puppy. Okay? If you're going to discipline or encourage, you have to have a different level. It's not one size fits all. And you know, to Bill's credit and his heart, he was here the next Sunday.
So that, though, takes some effort to figure out which stick to use, and
you have to know each other.
And there's where the challenges are for us, because we don't. That's a risk when we do that. Did I use the right stick? Did I, by saying anything, am I helping this person, or did I just make it worse? It's a hard one for us to know. I would say when it comes to these kinds of things, positive action is better than no action at all. Indifference or lack of action will not help us in those situations most of the time.
Well, let me just add, we can second guess ourselves into doing nothing every time.
Every time. I've had, okay, they're probably fine. So, we're going to start on some of the questions in just a second, but in the conclusion in verse 24, this author points out that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. If we were in that situation, of whatever that is, would we want somebody else to do this thing for us, whatever that is? And if we can use that as our scale, our decision maker, would I want somebody to do that for me? If I was feeling down and out, would I want somebody to reach out? Now, some people might say, I want them to leave me alone. Ignore that. Go in anyway. Because most people will do better when we treat them in the way that the way we would want to be treated, that golden rule. Go ahead, Liz.
I was just going to say, I think not being indifferent or caring or loving affects not only ourselves, but also everyone around us. I've been personally affected by that. At one point, this was like several years ago, it was like a long drive to get to Wednesday night services. I stopped going. I was kind of indifferent just because it was a long drive and I was alone. And I thought, no one cares that I'm there Wednesday night. And I have a friend that then after a few weeks of not being there, approached me and was like, why aren't you there Wednesday night? We'd love to see you, and encouraging, and just knowing that she wasn't indifferent and actually noticed that I wasn't there really made a huge impact on me, and just wanted to bring up that
Good point.
changing that affects us and others around us.
And now you don't have to drive alone either.
Right.
Ah, look at that. Things have changed. All right.
Well, the guy that you just mentioned, we want people to think, we want to think that, well, we would want somebody to do that. And so you've got this person who's saying, I don't want that. We can't let another person's indifference make us indifferent. We still care about that person.
Right.
And so we can't let their lack of even self-care for themselves, sorry, I don't mean to be
Talking with your hands.
their lack of care for themselves can diminish our care for them.
Yeah. If you saw somebody standing on ice that you knew was thin and could at any second break, and you're trying to get them to come off, and they said, no, I'm fine, would their not caring that they could, I just saw a video of this, it was actually a polar plunge they were doing in Russia, and this lady jumped into the water, polar plunge, but there was a river, and she didn't realize this, and she got swept away under the ice. She didn't know how dangerous that situation was. And even if she didn't know that situation, even if they're rejecting, hey, you shouldn't be careful because even if they're rejecting, we still, in their best interest, how would we want to be treated if we were standing on this thin ice ourselves? Would we want somebody else to tell us that, even if we thought we were okay? I think the answer is we would want that person to reach out. So as we go to next week, we're going to start on the questions next week. If you have the chance to look through and kind of, they're different. This author was kind of interesting, and he picked different scriptures for the questions than he did for the lessons. So there's going to be some different ones in there. So look those up, and I appreciate your participation and instead of indifference tonight. It was nice of you.